The night was quieter than usual across the dusty plains of Red River Valley. The wind had gone still, and even the coyotes held their breath beneath the pale light of the moon. Inside the weather-beaten barn of the Carson Ranch, a lantern burned low, its weak flame flickering against rough wooden walls. The horses shifted restlessly, their soft snorts cutting through the silence. Ethan Carson, a lone cowboy hardened by years of solitude and sun, had just finished tending to his livestock after another long day. The man was tall, his frame broad from years of work, his skin leathered from dust and sun. He lived alone now, ever since the war had taken his brother and the land had taken his father. The ranch was his world, and it was all he had left. As he reached to snuff the lantern flame, something caught his attention, a faint sound, not from an animal, but human. A low groan, muffled and trembling. Ethan froze, the hair on his neck rising. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing toward the far stall near the back of the barn. The sound came again, soft, pained. Cautiously, he took a step forward, boots crunching against the hay. The horses stirred, uneasy. The closer he came, the more he could smell it, the metallic tang of blood. He raised the lantern higher, the light casting long shadows across the bales of hay and the rough planks of the wall. Then he saw her, a woman lying half, hidden behind a sack of grain. Her clothes were torn, soaked through with blood and dirt. One arm was wrapped around her midsection, the other limp at her side. Her face, pale as ghostlight, was streaked with mud and tears. For a long moment, Ethan simply stood there, a stranger, a bleeding woman in his barn, in the middle of nowhere. He looked out toward the horizon, but there were no lights, no wagons, no sign of pursuit, just endless darkness. She must have come on foot, he thought, or been dropped there. He knelt beside her, the straw creaking beneath his weight. Her breathing was shallow, ragged, her pulse weak. She wasn't some ranch hand or drifter. Her hands were too soft, her clothes too fine, though now ripped and bloodied. She didn't belong out here. Near her a revolver lay half, buried in the straw, elegant silver engraved. Not the kind of gun you found in a rancher's belt. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to be careful. The war had taught him not to trust what appeared helpless, but something in her face, the way her brow furrowed even in pain, stirred a rare flicker of mercy inside him. He lifted her carefully, her head falling against his shoulder. She was light, frighteningly so. Her breath was warm but shallow. Carrying her across the barn, he laid her down on an old cot he kept for cold nights when work ran too long. Her blood smeared across his shirt, bright against the fabric. He fetched a basin of water and an old rag, cleaning the wound as best he could. A bullet had grazed her side, not fatal, but deep enough to bleed heavily. Whoever she was, someone had tried to kill her. As he worked, he couldn't stop thinking, how had she found his ranch? No one came out here, not unless they were lost, desperate, or running from something. The storm clouds on the horizon flickered with distant lightning. The land outside whispered with the approach of wind. Ethan bound her wound with a strip of cloth, tightened it until the bleeding slowed. Then he sat beside the cot, staring at her face. She looked peaceful now, breathing more evenly, but even in that calm, there was something haunting about her, like a secret she carried beneath her skin. Hours passed. The night grew darker. Somewhere outside, a lone wolf howled. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaustion weighing on him. The stranger slept fitfully, murmuring something under her breath, words he couldn't quite catch. Before drifting into a light doze, Ethan glanced once more toward the barn doors and saw something that froze his blood. Boot prints, fresh ones, leading into the barn, and another set, smaller, leading out. Whoever had brought her here or hunted her might still be close. The cowboy's hand reached slowly for his rifle, leaning against the wall. His eyes never left the barn door as he rose to his feet. The horses shifted again, restless. The wind had picked up now, sweeping through the cracks in the boards. He checked the locks, listened. Nothing but silence. Yet he could feel it, that eerie stillness before something breaks. He turned back toward the woman one last time. She stirred, lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. Her hand twitched toward the revolver on the ground, instinct, even in sleep. Whoever she wasn't helpless. And Ethan Carson, though he didn't yet know it, had just stepped into a story that would change his life forever. As dawn began to creep across the horizon, he made a silent promise to himself. He'd keep her alive. At least until he knew who she was and what kind of danger had just found its way into his barn. But deep down, he already suspected the truth. This was no ordinary stranger. And whatever she was running from was now running straight toward him. The first light of dawn crept over the ridge, spreading a pale gold hue across the open land. The ranch stirred slowly under the glow, but inside the barn time seemed to stand still. Ethan Carson had not slept. The stranger lay motionless on the cot, her breathing steadier now, her skin no longer as ghostly pale. He sat near the doorway, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the horizon beyond the half-open barn doors. The faint boot prints he had seen hours ago were still etched in the dirt outside, though now softened by the dew. Whoever had been there had come close, too close, and vanished into the darkness before dawn. Ethan's mind worked through the details with the slow, disciplined patience of a man who had learned to survive by noticing what others missed. The revolver she carried was no ranch hand's weapon. It was crafted, engraved, expensive, the kind of firearm carried by outlaws or high-bred women who had something to protect. The wound itself, though messy, told another story. It was the kind made by a small-caliber pistol, not a rifle. A close-range shot. That meant whoever shot her wasn't some highwayman taking aim from afar. It was someone near her. Someone she likely knew. The sun climbed higher, the air warming. Ethan poured water from a tin pitcher and cleaned the blood from the wooden floor where she had lain. Each motion was careful, deliberate. The stranger slept, the rise and fall of her chest shallow but constant. Her face, even under the grime, held a kind of refined grace that didn't belong to this land, a face that carried both fear and defiance, as if she had spent her life running from something only she understood. By mid-morning she stirred again. Her fingers moved weakly over the blanket, her lips murmuring inaudible words. She was fighting to wake, but exhaustion kept pulling her back. Ethan watched her quietly. He knew he should take her into town, let the doctor at Red River Junction tend to her wound, and let the sheriff ask the questions that needed asking. But something in his gut told him not to. There was danger here, yes, but it didn't feel like the kind that belonged in a sheriff's hands. It felt bigger, quieter, heavier. Ethan's ranch sat miles from the nearest settlement, a stretch of land so forgotten most travelers bypassed it entirely. No one should have found it unless they knew exactly where to look. And yet, this stranger had stumbled straight into his barn, bleeding and armed with a gun worth more than the ranch itself. Hours passed before she opened her eyes fully. When she did, they flickered with confusion and pain. She stared up at the rafters for a long time before turning her gaze toward the dim light filtering through the slats. Her hand brushed her side instinctively, feeling the bandage. Then, with effort, she turned her head toward the sound of the horses shifting nearby. Ethan stayed where he was, silent. He watched as she scanned the barn, eyes landing briefly on her revolver resting beside the cot. Her fingers twitched, as if fighting the urge to reach for it, but weakness won. He could see questions forming behind her eyes, but he didn't ask his own. Not yet. Outside, the wind began to pick up. A dust storm was brewing far across the flats, a slow, moving wall of gold and red. Ethan rose, stepped outside, and latched the barn doors against the gusts that would soon roll through. When he turned back, she was watching him, not in fear, but with something like guarded awareness. She wasn't ordinary, even half conscious. Her eyes missed nothing. She noticed the rifle he carried, the placement of every tool on the wall, the bucket of water near the cot, details that most injured people wouldn't even register. Whoever she was, she had the instincts of someone trained to survive. Ethan poured her a small cup of water, placed it near her hand, then stepped back. The silence stretched on, broken only by the restless stomping of horses and the faint whistle of the rising wind outside. For the rest of the day, he worked around the barn and kept watch. The storm rolled in hard by evening, filling the valley with red dust that turned the sky into a swirling blur. The wind howled against the barn doors, shaking the hinges and rattling loose boards. Inside, the lantern light flickered wildly. The stranger's fever rose again. Ethan dipped the rag in cool water, pressing it gently to her forehead, changing the bandage as the storm roared beyond the walls. By nightfall, thunder rolled across the sky. The barn shook, but inside that small space, an odd stillness settled between them, two souls caught in a storm neither had chosen. When the wind finally died, the air was heavy with silence. Ethan stepped outside to check the land, and what he saw sent a chill through his bones. Rider tracks, 3 of them, fresh, cutting straight across the field toward his property, and ending not far from the barn. Whoever they were, they had stopped here, then turned back. He knelt, tracing a gloved hand along the impressions in the dirt. The tracks were heavy, deep, meaning the riders were armed or carrying something weighty. When he returned inside, the woman's eyes were open again. She was awake now, more alert than before. And though she said nothing, he could tell by the tightness in her jaw that she understood. Whoever she had been running from had found her trail. The storm had only bought them time. Ethan moved quietly around the barn, dousing the lantern. Shadows swallowed the space once more. The woman lay still, her hand inching closer to her revolver, though her body trembled from weakness. Ethan's mind worked fast. He had lived through ambushes before. He knew the patterns, first the scout, then the hunt. They'd be back, maybe at dawn, maybe sooner, and this stranger, whoever she truly was, had brought the kind of trouble that didn't stop until someone lay dead. As he watched her eyes close again, he realized something unsettling. The fear she carried wasn't just for herself. It was for whoever dared to help her. Outside, the land lay silent once more, too silent. The storm clouds drifted east, clearing the sky to reveal a cold, hard moon. Its light washed across the dirt path where the riders had been, glinting off something small half, buried in the dust. A silver emblem. Ethan picked it up, turning it over in his hand. The mark was unmistakable, a sheriff's star. He looked toward the barn, where the woman now slept once more, the faint shimmer of moonlight touching her face. And for the first time, Ethan wondered if the law itself might be the danger she was running from. The night deepened, and the wind began again, soft, uncertain, whispering secrets through the cracks in the walls. Whatever truth this woman carried was only beginning to unfold, and by the time the next sunrise came, Ethan Carson would no longer be just a witness to it. He would be part of it. The morning sun rose over Red River Valley, slow and golden, painting long shadows across the Carson Ranch. The storm had passed, leaving the land quiet again, but it was the kind of quiet that didn't bring peace. It was the stillness that came when danger crouched just beyond the horizon, waiting. Ethan Carson stood outside the barn, the silver emblem still in his hand. The sheriff's star gleamed faintly in the light, half polished by the dust of the night before. He turned it over again and again, feeling the weight of its cold metal against his calloused fingers. He had seen men wear that same badge in town, men who claimed to bring justice, but often delivered only fear. Some were honest, most were not. That was the way of things in these lands. And if the tracks he saw belonged to lawmen, it meant trouble far worse than outlaws or thieves. Inside the barn, the stranger was awake. Her fever had broken in the night, and though weak, her eyes were sharp now, alert, calculating. She had the look of someone used to danger, someone who measured every move before she made it. Ethan watched her from the doorway as she sat up slowly, her face drawn with pain. The morning light touched her hair, revealing it was not brown as he had thought, but a deep shade of auburn beneath the dirt. Her clothes were torn beyond repair, the once fine fabric ruined by blood and mud. Yet even like this, she carried herself with a certain poise, something born of upbringing, not chance. He laid the star on the small wooden table near the cot. The metal glinted between them like an unspoken question. The woman's gaze lingered on it for a long moment. Then she looked away, her expression unreadable. Ethan didn't ask her name, and she didn't offer it. There were things better left unsaid until the truth came on its own. Still, as he cleaned the barn and tended the horses, he felt her eyes on him more than once, studying, assessing, perhaps even weighing whether to trust him. By noon, he had set a small fire outside the barn, and cooked what little he had: beans and a slice of salt pork. The scent filled the air, carried on the soft breeze that moved across the valley. The world looked calm again, deceptively so. But when he looked out toward the ridge, he saw it, the faint glimmer of movement far off in the distance. Riders again, maybe the same ones, maybe more. Whoever they were keeping their distance now, waiting. The woman must have seen it too, because when Ethan returned to the barn, her revolver was gone from where it had lain beside the cot. She had it now, resting across her lap, her finger hovering near the trigger. She wasn't resting any more. She was preparing. The air between them grew heavy, though neither spoke a word. Ethan could see the decision written in her posture. She was ready to run if she had to. And if those riders returned, she wouldn't go quietly. The afternoon sun bled into evening, turning the sky crimson. Ethan's instincts, honed by years of living on the edge of violence, told him something was coming. He moved the horses into the corral, checked his rifle, and waited. As darkness fell, the air grew colder. The sound came first, faint hoofbeats echoing through the stillness, distant but deliberate. 3 horses again, maybe 4 this time, moving slow, steady, careful. They stopped near the edge of the field, too far for faces to be seen, but close enough that their presence sent a shiver through the night. Ethan doused the lantern inside the barn. Shadows swallowed the walls. Only the faint crack of moonlight through the boards lit the woman's pale face. The riders waited a long while, as if testing the silence. Then one of them moved, turning his horse toward the valley road. The others followed, but as they left, something caught the moonlight, a flash of silver on the leader's chest. A badge, the same as the one Ethan had found in the dirt. When their hoofbeats finally faded, the woman sank back onto the cot, trembling from exhaustion and the effort it took to stay alert. The revolver slipped from her hand. Ethan waited a while longer, listening, before striking a match to relight the lantern. Its small flame filled the barn again, warm and soft against the wooden walls. He looked at her then, really looked. The grime and blood still clung to her, but beneath it all, he could see the faint traces of something unmistakable: refinement. Her hands were too delicate for ranch work. The fabric of her torn blouse was fine silk, not cotton. Even the revolver, with its custom engravings, spoke of wealth and power. Whoever she was, she hadn't just stumbled here. She had fled from something much larger, something with reach far beyond this valley. As the night deepened, Ethan sat by the doorway, his rifle across his knees, eyes on the horizon. The woman slept fitfully, murmuring again in her dreams. Once he caught a word, a name, maybe, but it faded before he could make sense of it. Hours passed in uneasy quiet. Then, just before dawn, he heard it, a sound so faint he might have missed it had the world not been so still. Metal against stone. He stood quickly, moving to the edge of the barn. Outside the light was pale, the horizon still dark. The sound came again, closer now. Someone was walking along the fence line. Ethan gripped his rifle, moving silently toward the door. A figure appeared from behind the corral, cloaked in dust and shadow. For a heartbeat, Ethan thought it might be another outlaw, or one of the riders returned. But then the figure stepped forward into the dim light, a man in a deputy's coat, his badge catching the first glint of dawn. He looked around, cautious, scanning the land before calling out the sharp, commanding tone that carried across the field, though the words themselves were lost to distance. Ethan stayed hidden in the doorway, his breath steady, his pulse calm. The deputy moved closer, following the tracks that led directly to the barn doors. Inside, the woman had woken again, her eyes, wide with fear, locked on the shadow, moving closer. She tried to rise, but winced from pain, gripping her wound. The deputy stopped just short of the barn, dismounted, and crouched beside the door. He examined the ground, running a finger through the faint prints of Ethan's boots. Then he straightened, hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Ethan could see his face now, hard, cold, deliberate. A man used to hunting, not serving, and in that moment he understood. These weren't lawmen searching for justice. They were hunters, and the woman inside his barn was their prey. The deputy turned, signaling to someone unseen beyond the ridge. Two more shadows moved into view, their horses emerging from the haze of early light. Ethan's grip on the rifle tightened. The stranger in his barn was not who she seemed, that much he knew now. But as the riders approached, he realized something else, something far more dangerous. By sheltering her, by giving her a place to hide, he had already chosen a side. And soon, before the sun was high, that choice would demand blood. The first rays of dawn broke through the thin veil of mist across Red River Valley, washing the land in ghostly gold. The air was sharp, cold, and heavy with the scent of dust. Ethan Carson stood at the edge of his barn, rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the figures advancing slowly from the ridge. 3 riders, the same number as before, but this time they didn't stay hidden. They came openly, their horses moving in a deliberate, measured trot that told Ethan everything he needed to know. These weren't wanderers or lawmen on patrol. These were men who wanted to be seen. The lead rider was the deputy he'd spotted earlier, the one with the star pinned to his coat, and the look of a man who'd done far worse than any outlaw he'd ever claimed to chase. His face was narrow, scarred, his eyes sharp and colorless like the blade of a knife. The other 2 trailed behind him, both armed, both scanning the land as they rode. Inside the barn, the woman stirred. The fever had broken fully now, replaced by an awareness sharper than fear. She sat upright, one hand gripping her revolver, the other pressed lightly to her bandaged side. Her gaze met Ethan's for only a heartbeat, long enough for both to understand what had to be done. The hunters were close. Ethan moved swiftly and silently, pulling down the lantern and covering it with a rag to hide the light. The barn fell into shadows once more. He crossed to the far stall, checking his rifle and loading fresh rounds with calm precision. Every sound, the click of metal, the creak of wood, felt like thunder in the heavy stillness. Outside, the horses stopped. The deputy dismounted first, boots sinking into the soft dirt. He turned, signaling the others to spread out. One moved toward the corral, another toward the old windmill by the trough. The deputy approached the barn, his hand never straying far from the pistol on his belt. Ethan's pulse slowed. His years of isolation, of quiet survival, had taught him how to wait, how to let danger come close enough to see its eyes before deciding if it was worth the shot. The deputy reached the doors. His gloved fingers brushed against the wood, tracing the edge where the hinges met the frame. Then, with the slow patience of a predator, he pushed one door open. The hinges groaned. Light spilled inside, slanting across the floor in a bright line that crept toward the cot, where the woman sat motionless. She didn't flinch. Her revolver lay hidden beneath the blanket, her eyes fixed on the door. Ethan stood in the shadows above, high in the loft, his rifle trained on the doorway. For a long moment, no one moved. The deputy's breath came slow and steady, his boots scraping against the wooden threshold as he stepped halfway inside. Dust floated in the air between them like drifting ash. Then the faint click of a revolver's hammer pulling back. The deputy froze, head tilting slightly. He wasn't foolish. He knew what that sound meant. Slowly, he stepped back, raising his voice not in words Ethan could hear, but in a sharp command to his men outside. The moment broke. Ethan saw one of the other riders circling toward the rear of the barn, another moving along the side. They were surrounding it. They'd burn him out if they couldn't flush him out. He dropped from the loft silently, landing in the hay behind the stalls. The woman turned her head slightly, eyes following him, but still calm, steady, unflinching. The first gunshot shattered the dawn. A bullet tore through the upper boards of the barn, splintering the wood inches above Ethan's head. The horses screamed, rearing against their ropes. Dust exploded into the air. Ethan ducked low, rolling behind a stack of feed sacks. Another shot followed, then another, until the air filled with the deafening thunder of gunfire. The woman moved then, crawling to the far side of the barn, her revolver gripped tight in one trembling hand. Blood seeped through the bandage again, but she ignored it. Her movements were sure, practiced. She'd been in fights before. Outside, the deputy barked orders. One of his men climbed the side fence, trying to get a higher shot. Ethan caught sight of him, through a gap between the boards, just long enough to aim. The rifle cracked once, the shot clean and final. The man fell, tumbling into the dirt below. The sound echoed through the valley, then silence, heavy and tense. The deputy didn't retreat. If anything, his calm seemed to deepen. He stepped out from behind his horse and stared at the barn, hands still, eyes sharp. He looked like a man studying a problem that only needed time to solve. Inside, Ethan reloaded, keeping one eye on the woman. She was pale again, her breath shallow, but she hadn't lost her focus. Minutes dragged into hours. The sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and painting the land in harsh light. The deputy and his last man didn't leave. They waited, patient as wolves. Ethan knew what they were doing, starving them out. The barn had only one exit, and the water barrels were nearly empty. He couldn't hold forever. As afternoon turned to evening, the heat grew suffocating. The woman leaned against the stall door, her face beaded with sweat. Ethan watched her carefully, the unspoken truth settling between them. She wouldn't last another night if they didn't move. When the sun began to sink, painting the valley in blood, red light, Ethan made his choice. He crept toward the rear of the barn where a narrow opening led to the back pasture, a small crawl space used for drainage after rain. If they could make it through there, they might reach the canyon beyond the ridge before nightfall. He pointed toward the space, and the woman understood. Slowly, painfully, she began to crawl toward it, clutching her revolver. Ethan covered her movement, watching the shadows outside. Then, as she reached the opening, something caught his eye, a glimmer of movement at the far edge of the field. The deputy was gone. Ethan's stomach dropped. He turned toward the front of the barn, just as the sound of boots on gravel came from behind him. The door burst open. The deputy stepped inside, his revolver already raised, his eyes burning with cold purpose. For a moment, the two men stared at each other through the haze of dust and sunlight. The barn fell silent, except for the ragged breathing of the woman behind the stalls. And in that stillness, Ethan finally saw it. The emblem on the deputy's badge was no longer the mark of Red River's law. It had been carved, altered, the letters filed down, replaced with a symbol he didn't recognize. This wasn't a lawman at all. He was something else entirely. The shot came quick, too quick to think. Ethan dove sideways as the deputy fired, the bullet grazing his arm. The rifle went off in the same instant, echoing like thunder inside the wooden walls. Dust rained from the rafters. The horses screamed again. When the smoke cleared, the deputy was gone. The door swung half open, the sound of galloping fading into the distance. The woman crawled toward Ethan, pale but alive. She reached for the edge of his sleeve, gripping it tightly as if anchoring herself to the moment. The air inside the barn was heavy with smoke and the scent of gunpowder. The horizon outside burned gold and crimson. Ethan stared after the fleeing rider, his pulse pounding. Whoever that man was, whatever secret he carried, it was tied to the woman in his barn. And now it was tied to him. The valley had gone still again, but not with peace. This was the quiet before the next storm. And Ethan Carson knew the next one would come for both of them. Night fell over the valley like a dark tide. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of smoke and dust. The gunfire had ceased hours ago, but the silence that followed was far more unsettling. Ethan Carson sat beside the barn door, his arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage, his mind replaying every moment of what had just happened. The deputy's attack had come fast and without warning, a test, perhaps, or a warning of something bigger. The way the man moved, the precision of his aim, and that strange emblem carved into his badge, none of it belonged to a simple lawman. It was something older, colder, and far more deliberate. Inside, the woman rested again, though not peacefully. Her breathing came in shallow bursts, her face pale against the shadowed light. She was weak, but awake enough to sense that the fight was far from over. The wound at her side had reopened during the struggle, the bandage now stained fresh with red. Ethan knew they couldn't stay. The deputy would return, and not alone this time. The hunters would come with numbers, with fire, with a reason to make sure there were no survivors. He had seen that kind of determination before years ago, during the war, when men fought not for justice, but for silence. He rose, gathering supplies, a canteen, some jerky, a small pouch of ammunition. Every motion was quiet, precise, the practiced rhythm of a man used to leaving everything behind on a moment's notice. He looked once more at the woman. She lay half conscious, her revolver still within reach, her other hand clutching something hidden beneath her torn coat, a small leather-bound satchel. He hadn't noticed it before. Now, in the dim flicker of the lantern, it caught his eye. It was old, worn, and sealed shut with a strange brass clasp, marked with the same carved insignia that had been etched onto the deputy's false badge. Ethan didn't touch it. Some secrets were better left until they demanded to be known. As dawn approached, he prepared 2 horses, one for himself and one for her. She was too weak to ride on her own, so he secured her carefully in the saddle, supporting her with one arm as they rode out into the rising light. The land stretched endless before them, dry and golden beneath a bruised sky. They rode in silence. The world around them was waking, birds calling from the mesquite trees, wind stirring the tall grass, but the peace was fragile. Every sound made Ethan's hand twitch toward his holster. Every flicker of movement on the horizon looked like the glint of another rider's gun. By midday, the heat grew merciless. They stopped near a narrow creek bed, hidden beneath the shade of a canyon ridge. Ethan helped the woman down and gave her water. She drank slowly, eyes closed, her hands trembling. When she finally looked up, there was a change in her, a kind of resignation, the look of someone who knew running was no longer enough. She reached into her coat, pulling the small satchel from beneath the folds of fabric. Her fingers hesitated on the clasp, then loosened it. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, was a bundle of papers, letters, official seals, and a single black and white photograph. Ethan caught only fragments in the shifting light, the seal of the territorial marshal's office, a name Haft worn from the corner, and a date. The photograph showed a group of men in front of a courthouse, men in long coats, each wearing the same star-shaped badge with the carved symbol. The same symbol from the deputy's badge, the same symbol on her satchel. And standing among them, in the center of the group, was the woman herself, not as a captive or a bystander, but as one of them. The truth struck like a hammer. She hadn't been running from the law. She was the law, or had been once. Whatever had happened to make the hunters turn on her had been buried deep. Ethan turned away, staring down the canyon path. The sun burned high now, blinding and merciless. He didn't need to ask what came next. Her silence told him enough. There was a secret in those papers, something men were willing to kill to keep quiet. And now that he'd seen it, he was part of that secret too. They rested until sunset, then rode again under the cover of night. The land shifted as they traveled, from open plain to broken rock, to the jagged ravines that cut through the heart of the valley like scars. The stars stretched endless above them, cold and distant. At one point the woman's strength faltered. She nearly fell from the saddle, her grip slipping. Ethan steadied her, pulling her close. Her breath was shallow, her head resting against his chest. She wasn't built for this life, he thought. She wasn't meant for blood and sand and the endless ache of survival. Yet here she was, defying everything that should have broken her. As the night deepened, they reached an abandoned mining camp, a scatter of collapsed shacks and rusted rail tracks. Ethan led the horses into the shadows of a half-standing cabin, the walls leaning but still enough to block the wind. They dismounted, and he helped her inside. The moonlight cut through a hole in the roof, falling across the dusty floor. She lay down near the wall, her hand still clutching the satchel. Ethan sat by the entrance, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the doorway. The desert was silent again, too silent. He'd learned long ago that silence like this never lasted. Sometime near midnight, he saw the flicker faint, far to the south, a line of lights moving slowly, deliberately. Torches, riders, they'd found the trail again. He reached for his rifle, heart pounding steady but slow. The woman stirred, her eyes opening halfway. She didn't need to ask. She already knew. The riders were still distant a half hour, maybe less. He could see the faint reflection of metal among the torches, the shine of polished barrels, and the glint of stars on badges. Ethan checked his ammunition. He had 5 rounds left in the rifle, 6 in the revolver, it wouldn't be enough. He looked back at the woman one last time. She had turned her face toward him now, her eyes reflecting the faint light of the fire he'd built earlier. She seemed calm, far too calm for someone facing death, and in that stillness he understood something without words. She wasn't afraid to die. She was afraid of what they carried, of what those papers revealed. The hunters weren't coming for her body. They were coming for the truth she had stolen. The flames outside were closer now. The echo of hoofbeats rolled through the canyon walls like distant thunder. Ethan rose slowly, his shadow stretching long against the broken floorboards. He knew this would end in blood. Whether it would be his or theirs didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was getting her, and whatever secret she carried beyond this canyon before dawn. He looked once more toward the mouth of the ravine, the wind cutting cold against his skin. The riders had stopped again, regrouping, their torches forming a slow, circling pattern of light in the distance. The woman's voice, weak but steady, broke the silence behind him, not in words, but in the faint, deliberate sound of a revolver being cocked. Ethan glanced back. She was ready. The hunt was far from over, but the next move would be theirs. The valley held its breath as the firelight crept closer, the line of riders spreading wide across the horizon like ghosts rising from the dust. And Ethan Carson, once just a quiet rancher, now stood on the edge of something far larger than he could understand, a war built on secrets and silence. The night was alive with fire. The riders had come. Their torches painted the canyon walls in streaks of red and gold, the flames twisting in the wind like restless spirits. Ethan watched them from the shadow of the ruined cabin, his breath slow, his rifle steady. The woman lay behind him, half hidden beneath a collapsed beam, her face pale but her eyes bright with an unspoken resolve. There was no running this time. The trail had ended here. Ethan had always believed that fate came softly, that a man could live quietly, tending his land and his horses, and never cross the line where peace turned into war. But tonight he realized how fragile that belief had been. The world had a way of finding those who tried hardest to escape it. The sound of hooves grew louder, echoing against the stone. 10 riders, maybe more. Their leader's silhouette moved ahead of the rest, tall, broad-shouldered, with a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. The same carved insignia glinted on his chest, the mark that had haunted the woman's every step. Ethan crouched lower, the rifle barrel resting on the cracked window ledge. The woman's breathing came slow behind him, controlled despite her weakness. In her trembling hand, she clutched the small leather satchel that had started it all. As the first riders dismounted, the leader raised a hand, signaling them to spread out. They were methodical, trained, not a gang of bounty hunters, but soldiers following orders. They moved in silence, scanning the rocks, checking every shadow. They knew she was close. Ethan's finger hovered over the trigger. He didn't want to kill again. He'd done enough of that in his life. But some moments didn't leave a man a choice. The first shot broke the stillness like thunder. A rider dropped from his horse before his torch hit the ground. The others scattered, shouting, drawing their weapons as fire spread through the dry grass. Ethan fired again, the recoil biting into his shoulder. The woman stirred, pushing herself upright despite the pain, her revolver gleaming faintly in the firelight. The canyon erupted into chaos. Gunfire echoed, horses screamed, and the scent of burning oil filled the air. Sparks rained down from the cliff edges as the fire caught the brush. Ethan moved fast, using the smoke for cover. He hit another man, then ducked behind the broken wall. Bullets tore through the boards above his head. The woman fired from the shadows, her shots precise, cold, deliberate, the movements of someone trained long before she'd ever become a fugitive. But for every man they struck down, two more advanced. The leader stepped into the open, his voice cold and steady as the others fell in line behind him. His coat brushed against the flames, his face revealed at last, sharp, weathered, marked by years of command. His badge gleamed in the firelight, the same symbol carved deep into its center. He wasn't here to capture her. He was here to erase her. The woman tried to rise, but the strength left her body. She dropped the satchel, its contents spilling into the dirt, letters, seals, and one torn photograph fluttering in the wind. Ethan's eyes caught it, the same courthouse image, the same group of lawmen. Only now the photograph had burned along one edge, revealing what had been hidden before. There was a 12th figure in the picture, the man who now stood before them, the one leading the hunt. The commander of the territorial marshals, her superior, and the secret she'd carried wasn't just proof of corruption. It was evidence of betrayal, a cover-up buried under years of violence and silence. Ethan saw it all at once. The ambush at the barn, the false deputies, the relentless chase. They weren't hunting a criminal. They were hunting the only person who had dared to expose them. The woman met his gaze, and in that moment, without words, Ethan understood what she intended to do. She gathered the papers with shaking hands, stuffing them into the satchel once more. Then, reaching beneath her coat, she pulled a small brass cylinder, a flare cartridge. Old military issue. Ethan knew what it was the instant he saw it. The leader saw it too. His voice cracked through the night, demanding she stop. His men hesitated, unsure. The woman's expression softened, almost peaceful now. The flames danced around her like a halo, her hair wild in the wind. She looked at Ethan, not in fear, not in sorrow, but in trust. Then she pulled the pin. The flare erupted into blinding light, a storm of sparks and smoke that swallowed the canyon whole. The explosion tore through the air, hurling debris and fire in every direction. Horses bolted, the riders scattered. The old mine entrance behind the cabin gave way with a thunderous roar, collapsing in on itself and sealing the narrow path. When the smoke cleared, Ethan lay face down in the dust, his ears ringing, his vision blurred. He pushed himself up, coughing, his hands burned and shaking. The cabin was gone, reduced to ash and rubble. He searched frantically through the haze, calling out into the silence. But there was no answer, only the crackle of dying fire and the whisper of wind through the canyon. Near the collapsed ridge, half buried beneath rock and ash, he found the satchel, scorched, torn, but still intact. The papers inside were charred along the edges, but the seals remained untouched. She had saved them. She had saved the truth. He stood there for a long time, the night stretching endless around him. The riders were gone. Those who survived had fled into the desert, leaving behind their fallen and their cause. The firelight dimmed until only the moon remained. When dawn finally came, Ethan mounted his horse and turned toward the horizon. The satchel hung from his shoulder, heavy not with weight, but with purpose. He didn't know where to go, only that the woman's sacrifice couldn't end in silence. Someone, somewhere, had to know what she'd died for. He rode for days, crossing valleys and plains, through storms and heat, until he reached the nearest township, a small settlement on the edge of nowhere. There, he left the satchel with a traveling preacher who carried letters east with the mail wagon. He told him only this: deliver it to the federal marshal's office in Denver. Then, without another word, Ethan disappeared into the hills. Weeks later, word spread across the territories. A network of corrupt lawmen had been exposed. Names were spoken aloud that had long been protected by power and fear. And among the reports was the story of a fallen agent, a woman who had vanished in the desert, presumed dead. Her name cleared at last. They never spoke of the man who'd ridden beside her, or the lonely ranch where it all began. But some nights, when the wind carried across the plains, the locals swore they saw a single rider at the edge of the horizon, a tall figure in a dusty hat, watching the sunrise with something heavy slung over his saddle, a reminder that even in the harshest lands, some promises never die.